The American Revolution wound up being closely associated with the French Revolution, and these two revolutions were, it's true that these two revolutions were an inspiration for Republican and nationalist revolutions in Europe and South America thereafter in the 19th century against imperial or royal governments. So these revolutionaries in Europe and Latin America used these two revolutions as a model of how to build a republican and democratic government. So there's a long history for seeing these two revolutions as sister revolutions. But that is a very incorrect reading. They were both republican revolutions, but the American Revolution was launched to limit the power of the central government and protect the power of local governments. The French Revolution aimed to do the exact opposite. Both were successful, which is why France emerged from its revolution as a very centralized and authoritarian republic, whereas the United States emerged from its revolution as a decentralized republic with limited government at its center. A central government that is shackled and limited in its powers and abilities. This difference is apparent when you compare the American Bill of Rights to the French Declaration of Rights. The French Declaration of Rights lists all the rights of the citizen. This list was then distributed to the counties and townships of revolutionary France to let people know what rights they have so that they can know if their rights were being abridged or violated by their local landlord or landholder, the local government, the church, etc. And if they found that their civil rights were indeed violated, they were invited to report this outrage or these violations to the French revolutionary government in Paris, which will then address these violations. It will exert its authority over the local ruler or authority to punish and correct. And this is very different than the American Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights was a self-consciously anti-federalist document. In the sense that it reflected the fears of the anti-federalists, of those who opposed the new federal constitution, their fears about a central government that would be so strong they will be able to do A, B, C, and D at the local level in your community. So the Bill of Rights does not declare that you, John Q. Public, have the right to speak freely or to worship freely or to have a gun, etc. Rather, it lists all the things that the federal government is not permitted to do. Okay, so it's not a list of your rights, but a list of prohibitions on the federal government. Okay? This is why free speech or habeas corpus, etc., are not things that are enjoyed by American citizens alone. Okay, so it's not rights reserved for American citizens. Okay, every tourist, every person who happens to be here, every homeowners association, every corporation, every labor union, every church, they all enjoy these freedoms. Because, again, because the Bill of Rights does not list the people or types of people or classes of people who have the right to free or free exercise of religion. It merely states that the federal government does not have the authority to pass any laws regulating speech or religion or guns or this or that. And then after all these prohibitions, the 9th and 10th Amendments, kind of a security or insurance policy, clarifying that anything else that we didn't mention the federal government cannot do, it cannot do. Okay, if we forgot to mention things that the federal government cannot do, those things that we forgot, the federal government is not allowed to do. So the central difference between the French and American documents is that the American Bill of Rights reflects fear of the central government. It protects the citizenry from the central government. The French Declaration of Rights reflects trust in the federal government. It places a strong interventionist central government to protect the citizenry from local authorities, the aristocracy, the church. So European republicanism was centralized and authoritarian, consolidating power in the national government at the expense of local governments. American revolutionists and those who wrote the Constitution, the Federalists who followed the revolutionists, and certainly those who framed the Bill of Rights, those anti-federalists whose demands or fears gave shape to the Bill of Rights, they all were products of a political culture that was convinced that people with power will abuse it. People with power will abuse it. This was this quirk of English thinking. And so they were very fearful of a strong, powerful central government, because they were convinced that that would invite abuse. So a local official with a little bit of power will abuse that little bit of power. But a federal official with a great deal of power will abuse that great power. And their solution, the American solution to this problem of human nature and human government was to keep power diffuse. Okay? Their driving fear was concentrated, centralized power. And again, the French revolutionists did not share this political philosophy. They did not fear, or I don't know about the French, but those who shaped the French revolutionary state did not fear centralized power. They welcomed it. They saw it as a protective force against the abuse of local rulers. But when people talk about the American creed, what they're talking about is limited government. And this is not because Americans were or are political philosophers, okay? That they're constantly thinking in, preoccupied by the nature of government and the concepts of positive and negative liberty, et cetera, et cetera. Americans were, and I think remain, fairly simple meat and potatoes folks. So the American ethos boils down to limited government, because when the government is limited, what's left is autonomy. Okay? If the government doesn't have a lot of power to control things, power devolves lower and lower. Okay? So what's left is autonomy, not for the individual, but for families and communities. Because none of us lives in a vacuum as a solo actor. Someone will restrict you or punish you or reward you or help you. It's going to be your family or your community or your local government or your state government or your national government. Somebody will govern your life and organize your life and provide all sorts of incentives and punishments. And Americans have traditionally been wary about the national government. Again, fearful about concentrating a lot of power in one institution or one person. And so instead of granting the central government the power to really govern things in your community, Americans have traditionally preferred to leave most of the authority to manage and control and direct people in the hands of the family and the community. They wanted the state government to govern less than the local government. And they wanted the national government to govern even less than that. By contrast, European revolutionaries and reformers, and Latin American ones, tended to see the community, the family, the community, the church as benighted and oppressive, benighted, corrupt, oppressive institutions that are oppressive or threatening to the individual. And so they empowered the national government as a counterweight to that. They still see the government, the national government, as the protector of the individual against his family, local community, local courts, and local government. The Madisonian conception of America was, or the Madisonian conception of republicanism was diametrically different. And that is why the American Constitution creates a very different kind of republic. So it really does highlight how, not just how different, but how diametrically opposed the French Revolution and American Revolution are.